Okay, I'm back again to start a lecture on another topic, and we're going to start again from the splash page that I use to get into Blackboard. I'll go to our course, which is right here, and let's just see, I just finished a little while ago doing the lecture on topic 20. Let's see if it's up and ready to go in PowerPoints. PowerPoints right here. I think I'll turn that off so it's cleaner. And here's the one I just did on 19. So we're going to be doing this one on 20. And as long as we're here, let's open up this PowerPoint and use Microsoft's PowerPoint to open it up. Enable editing. Okay, good. We are on the topic of the business cycle, question 20. Ooh, is that right? I thought it might be question 21. Let's go back here. And no, it is question 20. Now, we may as well go back and take a look at the topics too while we're at it. Get that question up here. Lecture topics. Open another tab. Let's open it up. Come on. There we go. Topic 20, the business cycle. Oh, good. There is this handout here that we can open up. Let's open it up. Oh, I hope it opens. There we go. We'll come back to this. It basically is U.S. business cycle expansions and contractions, published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a private think tank founded by Wesley Mitchell, probably about a century ago, to study business cycles. Institutionalist economist and student of Thorstein Veblen. So the National Bureau of Economic Research is the bureau that calls turning points in the business cycle, contractions and expansions. And sort of different than the textbook, there's only going to be four parts of the business cycle as the National Bureau looks at it. And that is, you can see the contraction, and then from peak to the trough, that's a contraction. And then we get to the trough, and we go from the previous trough to the peak, the expansion, and then we get to the peak and we go back into the contraction. So the four parts, as I've said it, are peak, contraction, trough, expansion. And as we'll see in the PowerPoint, our textbook does it a little differently. They add a fifth element in the business cycle. But basically, business cycles are based upon the growth or contraction of real GDP. All right, let's go back to our PowerPoint and open it up. And here we go. And I may want to draw on this. I think I will. And here we go. Let's get to the first slide where it says the term business cycle or economic cycle refers to economy-wide fluctuations in production or economic activity over several months or years. These fluctuations occur around a long-term growth trend and typically involve shifts over time between periods of relatively rapid economic growth, expansion or boom, and periods of relative stagnation or decline, contraction or recession. And these fluctuations are measured using the growth rate of real gross domestic product. Despite being termed cycles, most of these fluctuations in economic activity do not follow a mechanical or predictable periodic pattern. So let's take a look at this. So they do include fluctuations around a long-term growth trend, and we're going to see that in the next one. And they are shifts between relatively rapid economic growth. I don't know about the rapid part, but I would say growth in periods of relative stagnation or decline. So, and I would say decline, recession, expansion. Contraction is another name for recession. So, oops, let's stay here. These fluctuations are measured in the growth rate of GDP. And really, we're going to simplify this and just say, if GDP is falling, we are in a recession or a contraction. And if GDP is growing, we are in an expansion, okay? So the main thing to take from this is that the fluctuations, if we can say this, are in, let me see if I can use my little pen, if I can find it. Not there, not there. Oh, I don't think I can find it. Oh, here it is. Real GDP. All right. And real GDP is just nominal GDP divided by some base year GDP, okay? All right, so let's explore further this idea of business cycle. Now here is your sort of mechanical, I guess the last slide talked about mechanical fluctuation. We do indeed have our growth trend right here, which is the rate of growth over time. And notice that we have time on the horizontal axis. And we have real GDP here. So as real GDP grows, of course, we are in an expansion or recovery. And in fact, let's use a different colored pen and show this. So, of course, we're, maybe we can use a blue one here. So in the contraction, we have GDP falling. And then in the recovery, let's do this. We, of course, have GDP growing. I'd like a little wider pen. Let's go to this one. So it's growing. But up to this point, it's just recovering. And what we mean is it's reaching the same level as the previous peak. So this makes sense. And that's what the textbook calls a recovery period. And it only calls the expansion period. Let's make sure this is wide enough. Yeah. The expansion period from the time we reach the peak of the previous period on to the next peak. Whereas if we take a look at what the National Economic Bureau talks about, it's just the expansion from the previous trough to this peak. So that's their expansion. So when we look at this definition in the textbook, basically the National Bureau of Economic Research is, and if I will use this here, we're going from here to here. The National Bureau of Economic Research is calling this whole thing an expansion. But we'll go along with the textbook, since those are the multiple choice questions I'll be using on the exam. And the business cycle has 5 sections. It has the peak and the trough. It has the contraction, and then it has the recovery and the expansion. So peak 1, contraction 2, trough 3, recovery 4, and expansion to the next peak 5, okay? And these fluctuations occur around a trend line in growth. So let's go and take a look at what the real growth rate looks like. Maybe let's open it up here. I need to find the St. Louis Fed site, economic data from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And let's take a look at categories if we can. Where are the categories? Let's go back. Interest rates. Oh, there we go. Categories. And we want GDP. Here we go. National income and product accounts. Well, let's just open those up. And we want GDP measures. I think this will do it. And here's our GDP, real gross domestic product. So it's fluctuations in real GDP that matter here. Here we go, from 1929 to 2019. That gives us our longest one. Let's just click this. In billions of chain 2012 dollars, so they're using prices in 2012 to figure out the real GDP. And let's just add that to the graph. Let's see what our graph looks like. Oh, there you go. So hopefully you can see this easily enough. This goes from 1925, obviously. Here is the Great Recession, Great Depression. And in the 30s, we didn't increase very much. There may have been a slight slowdown in 1936, much more in 37. No, it actually starts about 1937, another recession in this Great Depression. Growth here, so now we are in World War II, starting right here. Okay, many people say that the World War got us out of it, and right at the end of it, we're in a small recession and a recovery. So these bars are the recessions or the contractions, and the wide areas are the expansions here. So this basically follows the same scenario as the Bureau of Economic Research. So on these gray lined areas, that's the peak, and then the trough is at the end, okay? I'm not sure if I'm getting it exactly at the trough. And 2008, 604, so it shrunk by about 400 billion. And some of these, it hardly looks like it shrank at all. A lot of very minor recessions. You can see it here in 1980, and then again in the late aughts, the Great Recession then. And of course here, the Great Depression hardly shows up at all in the way they have it figured here. Let's see, this is just a typical arithmetic scale, not a log scale. Okay, very good. Anyway, this is what the real business cycle looks like. Here, basically, you give this sort of archetype of a business cycle. It looks like more of a sinusoidal fluctuation, a sine or cosine curve. So anyway, it probably helps to think of it in this as the first slide said, the mechanical or predictable periodic pattern, but as we saw in the actual data, yeah, you can see that the length of the recessions in the gray bars and the length of the expansions in the white bars fluctuate quite a bit. So this macroeconomics is about business cycles and the things that happen during them. So let us continue with this PowerPoint lecture. And here is a definition of the business cycle. Turning points in the business cycle, the peak and the trough of a cycle, are defined by a rule of thumb after 6 months or 2 quarters of a change in direction of real GDP. So if the economy has been growing, a business expansion, and then 6 months of falling GDP occurs, real GDP, a peak in the business cycle has been reached and the economy has slipped into a recession. And vice versa, if it's been contracting and then it starts growing again, in other words, real GDP starts expanding, it has to expand for 6 months in a row or 2 quarters before they say we are out of a recession. And they is the National Bureau of Economic Research. They call the peaks and the troughs, okay? So you have to have at least 6 months of a change in direction. So if GDP shrinks for 2 or 3 months and then turns around, that'll just be a little blip, won't be a recession. Or an expansion if we're in a recession, okay? Okay. What's the next slide? So we have the National Bureau of Economic Research's link. Let's go back and look at that. I'd already pulled it up because it was on the topics list. So it looks like there have been 33 cycles since December of 1854, which was before the Civil War. Civil War starts right here in 1860. And what's curious about this is that data about GDP didn't begin to be collected until World War II. So really only in this period was the actual data we're talking about collected. All that previous data from where, let's take a look at it. So basically from, I'll have to go up from here back, or I guess you would say from here back. All of that has been sort of guesstimated. So they use a methodology to figure out, what the real GDP might have been if they had been measuring it. They use all sorts of things like the amount of corn and wheat grown and shipped, the amount of steel and coal produced and shipped, the amount of textiles produced and shipped, various sales figures from retail stores. They gather all that data and they try to make a guess of what happened. So, that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, is that the data, the GDP data we have has only been gathered really since World War II. And they started putting that together because during World War II, they needed to know what our production capacity was to see how much we could devote to war production and how much we could get by with producing to maintain the civilian population during that time. So basically, GDP was created to help in the war effort. There you go. So anyway, it looks like it's all the same, right? You probably wouldn't have even guessed it if I hadn't mentioned it. But let's take a look at expansions, and you can see the expansions, 46 before, they're all pretty short, going all the way up. Here's a pretty long one during World War I, basically that one. And then, of course, it's the 20s. The expansions don't look all that great, but the contractions do. Look at these contractions. Wow, 65 months. That's over 5 years. And now another one followed 3-year recession. Basically a 2-year recession, 2-year. Wow. You might start suspecting that must be the guesswork putting these data together. And then, of course, here is the Great Depression at 43 months, which isn't even the longest one in the history, supposedly. And they all get shorter and shorter and shorter, which basically used to mean that the Keynesian economists who were into managing aggregate demand thought they were doing a great job. And of course, the expansions start getting longer. Look at this one in the basically during the Kennedy administration, a big tax cut at the beginning, and a pretty long one from basically November of 82 to July of 90 during Reagan's years, 92, and then 121, 10 years under President Clinton. Here's a 6-year one under George W. Bush. And we just ended, with this coronavirus, we've just gone into a recession. It's going to be a pretty tough one. It's going to be an interesting time period to live through as far as macroeconomics. But June 2009 was the trough. And let's just call it as March of 2020 is going to be the peak. So that's going to be basically 10, not quite 11 years, a few months short of 11 years expansion. So that's going to beat this other one with President Clinton. So this one under President Obama and President Trump has been the longest expansion in all of this, interestingly enough. As long as we're talking about this, let's go to something another economist sent me today, a sudden stop for the economy. So here is what they forecast, which is just amazing. Because March is the last month of the first quarter, they're going to say we're going to shrink GDP by 6%. And all of that happened in March. And basically, we were growing in January and February. So the fall of that month this month right now was greater than 6%. In the next quarter, and this is just amazing, and these are on an annual basis, they think the economy is going to shrink at a 24% rate. In other words, it's just unimaginable. I don't think even during the start of the Civil War or the Great Depression it shrank that much. So hold on to your seats, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be pretty amazing if that happens. Wow, that is amazing. That's all I can say. Whew. Oh well, let's not dwell on this too much because I may want to go and cry somewhere. And the BEA data, I'm not sure what what this is. Let me copy it. Let's get away from that. I'm not sure what I'm looking at here. Let's go back to here and open up another one and just put that in there and see what we've got. Oh, I don't want that dot in there. Oh, Bureau of Economic Analysis, and we're taking a look at gross domestic product. The fourth quarter was up 2.1% on an annual basis. Personal income in February was up 0.6%. So let's take a look at gross domestic product if we can. Okay, no thanks. They always ask that. So, as you can see, third and fourth quarter are growing. So right up here, we were well above 3% for a number of quarters. This one is kind of low, again over 3%. The first quarter of this year, then just above 2% throughout 2019. So they really think that this is going to fall below zero for the first quarter here. All right. These are all positive growth rates. GDP is growing. All right. And let's take a look at this one that I copied from a book that Christina Romer, this is a graph Christina Romer had put together. Let's take a look at it. It's from the Civil War onwards. And here we go. Come on, let's see it. Oh, here it is. Okay. So you can see the black line is a growth trend. Let's just expand it here. And this goes from right after the Civil War in the United States all the way to here. And you can see this red is the Great Depression. And they call the growth line the potential GDP, and actual GDP follows these lines like this. Pretty close. You can see the recession's pretty small. This only goes to 2005 because I copied this over 10 years ago from another textbook. So the recession after the Civil War, expansion, but the potential GDP was growing pretty quickly back in here. All right. Quite interesting. Let's see what it says here. 69 to 28, Christina Romer, the pre-war business cycle reconsidered new estimates of gross national product. 69 to 2008, Journal of Political Economy. And then from 89, and that was in 1989, that was published. And then 29 to 2002, U.S. Department of Commerce, National Income Accounts. Basically, the Department of Commerce did this. What's interesting is Christina Romer, let's shrink this down, if I could only highlight her name here. As part of her study of this period, she realized that they were just estimating GDP in this period of time, and even really right up to World War II. And so she went and researched how they did estimate GDP during that time period. They weren't actually measuring it. And she used their methods to re-estimate GDP from the period after World War II onward. she thought that way she could compare them. And basically, from what we had seen before here, these periods was really up and down, and there were huge recessions, really violent, if you would, peaks and troughs. And everyone said, whoa, we're really into milder ground here. And unfortunately, what she found, and this is one reason I admire Christina Romer so much, is that if you use the same methodology that was used back here, you get the same sort of ups and downs, violent ups and violent downs, and many more recessions than you get in here if you use their estimated methodology. So, you have to be careful to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. And she, of course, claimed that we weren't. And really, later in the course, I'll come back to this, but what she's saying is that the belief that Keynesian interventions helped this period is pretty much disproven by the fact that it doesn't look any better than this period back here if you use the same method to measure real GDP. Whereas, if you were thinking that the same method was used, well, then this later period after World War II looks like much milder recessions than back here. And so her research indicated that may not well be true. All right, anyway, just a little bit of that. I don't know if we need to get into the U.S. government spending right now. That's for later when we take a look at the Keynesian policies. But we do get to this one, which is the last slide. I wanted to go back and take a look at exactly what the question is. So number 20, straw hypothetical graph. That would be like the one that we saw, sort of the sinusoidal graph, the archetypical graph with the 5 different parts. And then here, C, explain what is happening to output. That's real GDP, employment, and inflation in each phase of the cycle. And so I went ahead and just did this with the way the author of our textbook broke down the business cycle. So let's go back and take a look. And I just did this little table or matrix, and I broke the business cycle into peak, contraction, recession, trough, recovery, and expansion. So it pretty much followed, if we come back here, peak, contraction, trough, recovery, expansion. All right. And so if we come back here, we're going to take a look at output, which is real GDP. We're going to take a look at employment / unemployment, and price level, inflation, deflation. So at the peak, well, of course, we're at the high point in the business cycle with output, and employment growth is faltering. It's growing very slowly, but the unemployment rate is low. It's like recently it's been 3.7% at this last peak. And then inflation is usually higher than the rest of the cycle, which has been the curious thing about this cycle. It's that the inflation hasn't been that high, usually around under 2%, though lately it's been above 2%. I think I talked about that this semester, that maybe we are reaching the turning point. But then in the contraction, prices are usually falling. Certainly we're seeing that in oil and gas prices now, maybe in wages and other things too. I'm just wondering what's going to happen after this pandemic passes. So many people are going to have so much toilet paper and laundry soap that they won't have to buy it for a long time. I guess it would be a good time to stock up on those things if the prices do fall, or maybe the factories will just lay everyone off and wait until people start buying again. But employment is falling, and this is the huge thing. I think I've seen somewhere where they think employment could fall like by millions of people, 3 to 10 million people just in the last month. This is going to be quite tremendous fall in employment. So the unemployment rate will just really pop up there. I'm wondering if it'll get above 10%. Would have to get above 16 million people. Could get close. The employment population ratio, the number of people employed divided by the population, is going to be falling, is falling right now. Inflation at first holding steady, but then falling, and we'll have to see if it'll fall into deflation. In other words, where price levels will fall. At the trough, of course, GDP, real output, will reach a minimum. Employment will continue falling, but much more slowly. The unemployment rate may keep falling for a while. Rising. I'm sorry. I should say rising there. Unemployment may still be rising. Inflation was going to be low if we're not even in the deflationary period. And the recovery output obviously is rising, and sometimes quickly, but over the last 3 recoveries, it's risen very slowly. And from the end of the last recession in June of 2009, I believe it took 2.5 years. Recovery took 2.5 years to get back to the previous high. Amazing. So let's just take a look at that. Maybe we can go back to the Fred graph. Here we go. No, not that one. This one here. And let's shorten the period if we can from what should we put it at? 207. Let's two. About 2007. Yeah, there we go. So right in here was the peak. Let's see if we can't get it. 2008. Really wanted to look a little bit further. So let's just use that as a peak. 15,604 billion. And then we go down. It looks like the trough was hit here at 2008, but they didn't call the end of the recession until, well, can I get there? Can't get there. So then if this was 15,605, let's see where we get. So yeah, it looks like real GDP actually got there within a year. 804. By 2011, it was a little higher. We'd have to look at the data, I think, instead of the graph. All right, let's go back and talk about this. So employment is now rising, unemployment falling very quickly. Inflation is still pretty low during the recovery. Of course, the expansion, once we get into the expansion, GDP is still rising by definition, maybe much more slowly than in the recovery. And employment is probably rising quickly. The unemployment is falling more slowly, and inflation starts picking up steam as we reach capacity. So there you go. That's the end of the business cycle, and that is the end of the lecture on this topic. So